I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And Griffin Dunne, how do we even describe Griffin Dunne? Actor, producer, director, now memoirist. So the Friday Afternoon Club, a family memoir, is just out. And, not everyone can say that Sean Connery saved them from drowning in the family pool. But Griffin also is one of these people who has stories where you're like, honestly, if you read them in a novel, you'd be like, where was the editor? I'm sorry, I cannot believe piece after piece after piece. And you also have to think about the fact that Griffin's dad is Dominic Dunne. He really became a celebrity in his own right.
Yeah, he was a journalist, crime journalist.
And then, of course, your aunt and uncle, Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunne. And we'll get to all of them as well. But I want to start with you and why you wrote this book.
As you say, I tell a lot of stories, and I've been telling these stories, over the years, and for at least a decade, people have been saying, "Oh, you have a book. You got to write a book." And I would just sort of nod. But every time I told a story that I realized was unusual or extraordinarily fantastical that actually happened, I would keep note of it and let the story sort of build up. And so when it came time to actually do this, particularly at the urging of my agent, David Kuhn, I handed him about 50 something pages. And he thought I was just going to go off and, write something, but I've been secretly doing it anyway. And he said, "Oh, wow, I can sell this." And he drew up a beautiful proposal. And, at that time, I thought it was going to be a book I that influenced me a great deal. Sedaris's Me Talk Pretty one day.
Right.
And so I kind of thought it would be anecdotal stories in chapters about my family, with the family interconnecting. But I found when I went back, I decided to write it chronologically so I could see the thread. And I found that I didn't start like when I was born. I started with the Mexican Revolution that brought my mother or my grandmother to Nogales, the border town in Mexico, and the Great Famine, where my great grandfather came over, and it just led to my parents' biographies. Then I was eventually born after my father being in live television, and all these times I've always thought of it, in historical terms. And I always tried to frame as my life went on. So was the Vietnam War was happening. So was, these sort of world events. World War II was a very, prominent backdrop. Once the proposal went well and there was a lovely bidding war, and I chose Penguin and the wonderful editor there, John Burnham Schwartz. I just couldn't stop writing. I just started. I would write between takes on movie sets, back in my trailer. It would just became rather obsessive, and I came in well before the deadline that I was contracted to meet.
So wait, you also directed and produced Joan Didion, The Center Cannot Hold, the Netflix documentary from 2017 that got a lot of attention and I've seen multiple times, and I'm sure I'm not the only person who's watched it multiple times. Were you doing this in tandem with that as well?
No, no, I wasn't.
Okay.
I was far from, you know, thinking I would write a book, at least consciously, and certainly not where I would have said to Joan, while I was doing it. By the way, I'm writing a book. Now I wish I did. I'm often, you know, dreamed what and imagined what my father and aunt and uncle would have thought of this book. I think they would have been very, very proud. They so many of the things that they wrote came from such a personal perspective and their life perspective, and they were very candid about the periods in their lives. And as mentioned in the documentary, when Joan was contemplating divorcing John, she wrote about it,
Yeah.
and not only did she write about it, but her husband edited the piece.
Right.
So they've always been frank about their lives, and I think that sort of gave me freedom to write about my family from my perspective.
I also feel like you've always been in the public eye. Like everyone in your family has just kind of always lived very publicly, not just because you've been working in Hollywood or whatnot, but just, I mean, your dad obviously created this second career when your sister was murdered.
Hmm.
And the trial was really kind of gruesome, I think is the
Yeah.
best way to describe it. But
Disaster.
Vanity Fair was relaunching, and with it, your dad sort of took on this whole new trajectory, and then also was writing novels that were bestsellers. And if you're of a certain age, you remember everyone's parents having copies, whether they were hardcovers or mass markets, just wherever you were, there were always copies of Dominic Dunne's books on the shelves. And it was kind of a moment for you guys. But I mean, have you ever actually had privacy?
I never really thought of the way you described that, but you're quite right. I guess we were in the public eye or around, my childhood was very much, I grew up around celebrities, some of the greatest filmmakers, and George Stevens and Billy Wilder and William Wellman. And these were all people that, would come to our house that I unfortunately was too young to really appreciate, their work. As I got older, these are the filmmakers I studied and admired. But the importance in my father's early years as young husband and father, the importance he placed on knowing celebrities and that he was entertaining them was sort of out of proportion with his own accomplishments. And he was a television producer, but he had from childhood a worship, an idol worship for celebrity and movie stars and directors and movies in general. So in a way, that was sort of in the public eye, the importance of being of exposure, of being famous, and all that kind of stuff, which which kind of rubbed me the wrong way as I entered my teens. And I was determined. I did not want to be an actor. I wanted to actually be a journalist. I was very influenced by my aunt and uncle's writing, by Tom Wolfe, by Hunter Thompson, and I loved what Tom Wolfe would call, regretfully later, the new journalism. So I thought I would write, from that. But I got kicked out of school in the 10th grade, and I'd already been in a play, which I loved doing, Edward Albee's Zoo Story. So that ignited something in me, and I felt I was still dealing with dyslexia and all sorts of learning issues. I just didn't feel qualified to be able to be a writer without a college education. So I ended up moving to New York and becoming an actor.
Which is kind of wild when I hear you say that, because there are plenty of writers who never actually finished school. You just kind of decide that you're going to do it. And honestly, did Hunter Thompson ever finish school? Like, if I think about Fear and Loathing, I'm just kind of like, I don't know.
No, I think he just joined the Air Force and
right?
experienced life.
Yeah, there are just a lot of people like that.
Yeah.
Can I ask you to tell the Otto Preminger story? Because it's going to pull together Tom Wolfe, your aunt, you as a teenager, and a lot of acid.
Yes.
Sorry, it's a great story.
So my aunt and uncle gave probably their most famous party. It was a book party to launch Kool-Aid Acid Test, Tom Wolfe's book. And Janis Joplin was going to come to the party. And Joan, when she called to invite my mother, she said, I know how much Griffin loves Janis Joplin, invite him too, which I was 11, 12. It set me off in a flurry of excitement and insecurity and delusional behavior, where I thought, after deciding what I would wear, what love beads, my mother was taking me, and I imagined that I would meet Janis, and she would see what an extraordinary young man I was, and ask me, and she'd say, so where are you going after, or something, and I'd have to say, I came here with my mother. So I asked my mother, please don't say that you took me. She said, you want me to just pretend I'm just some girl, who came with you? I went, yeah, would that be all right? So
how old were you?
I was
13?
12, maybe,
okay.
Maybe even 13. Wildly precocious, very delusional. And so I go to this party, and of course, Janis has not arrived, and all the grown-ups are completely ignoring me. And I'm wandering from room to room filled with pot, and no one's really talking to me except this balding man with a German accent wearing a Nehru jacket grabs my wrist, pulls me down and sit next to me. And I recognized, oh my gosh, that's Colonel Klimp from Hogan's Heroes, my favorite TV show. And he goes, I have taken the acid, and I am having a terrible bummer. You're the only pure person here. You stay by me. You stay by me. You don't leave. And I'm thinking, I've got over my impression, being impressed by Colonel Klimp. He's holding on to me so hard. I'm trying to figure out how to get away from the Colonel. And I finally pull away, and he goes, stop, stop, young man. I will have you shot. And I don't think he really said that, but that's what I imagine. And I'm wandering around, and finally my mother says, we had a signal. She was going to wink at me when it was time to go home. And I said, oh, come on, Mom, Janice hasn't even gotten here yet. And she went, well, she's at the Palladium. Her show is running over, and she's going to be here too late. And it's a school night. I have to take you home. So I'm very upset I don't get to meet Janice. And so the next day, Joan calls as she does after a party. My aunt and uncle would call to rehash whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So they're calling to rehash, and then she says, put Griffin on. And so I tell her about this experience I had with Colonel Klimt, and Joan goes, John, pick up. And he picks up another extension. Tell it again. And they just roar with laughter. They said, that wasn't Colonel Klimt from Hogan's Heroes. That was the director, Otto Preminger, and who had just made Joan of Arc, where he nearly burned Gene Seberg to death. And they told me that. So I always figured I got off easy. So that was the time I met Otto Preminger.
But this is also a Hollywood that not a lot of people think about, right? Like when we think about the sort of glamour that your dad got caught up in the sort of the 40s and the 50s, what movies were then, right? They were sort of epic, and the celebrities' images were managed and all of these things. They were a cultural currency that has shifted.
Mm-hmm.
And, here you are at the intersection of major cultural moment film, right? Shifting into, we're going to stick with new journalism, because even though it's still kind of a funky phrase, it works for the purposes of context and everything else, right? So here you are at this intersection of serious cultural change. You're old enough to know that stuff's going on. I mean, you do also have a very funny story about being in high school and hanging out at a diner in one of the old hotels in Hollywood, which I think is gone now. But it also, there's some prostitutes, there's some stuff going on. And it's not what people think of when they think about Hollywood and that whole sort of film industry. And also your dad sort of being left on the side because he's a television producer. Like back in the day, television and film were two totally separate things. And if you were working in TV, you were maybe not as flashy.
You were a second-class citizen.
Yeah, right? So here you are processing all of this, and yet you just said, well, I wasn't really thinking about being an actor. I really kind of wasn't going to do it, but how do you not think about story all the time, given who you're surrounded by? And it also sounds like your mom, even though she didn't really work in the industry per se, she came out of theater with your dad. They met in college.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she knew how to tell a story, too. So it's not like you were ever going to get away from these people who knew what they were talking about, right?
Absolutely. I grew up on these, just sort of crazy stories about, my mother talking about, her father's her great uncle, with his mistress on his yacht, having a heart attack, and they boarded his body into the tender of the yacht and checked his dead body into the Breakers Hotel. And then they called his wife in Coronado, California, near San Diego, and she's in bed with her lover, who's the Admiral Bastido, and she said, I can bring you to the funeral if we get married tomorrow. And they get married the next day, and they go and try to attend the funeral. I just thought those stories were just hilarious. And they were all, we had in our house the front page of the Chicago paper with, a bride for a day, a widow, a bride and then a widow, So yes, I grew up around stories, and so yeah, it was inevitable I'd end up either being an actor or writing a memoir or both.
Right. Acting was a little rough of an entry, though, for you. And at one point, you're sharing an apartment in New York with none other than Carrie Fisher, who's an old friend from high school. She's having a little more success because, as she told you, she was working on this, sci-fi movie in London and running around with a monkey and, Star Wars being what it is. But you were selling popcorn at Radio City Music Hall. You weren't.
Excuse me, I was a popcorn concessionaire.
Ah, okay. Okay.
And I had a little paper hat, and
Excellent.
I didn't get to wear the whole epaulets of the ushers. They were, a higher rank. But the popcorn concessionaire was I had to just refill the popcorn at the movie counter, and but it also gave me keys to Rockefeller Center and all the and tremendous access. And there are tunnels that go underneath because John D. Rockefeller didn't want to mix with the common folk. So and down there was a zoo for the nativity scene, and I would feed the popcorn to the camels. I could wander onto the stage of NBC Nightly News. I could see the early rehearsals for a show called Saturday Night Live that was just starting. I've said of all my this isn't what I do for a living jobs, I love that one the most.
But isn't that also what got you to start thinking about producing? Because Chilly Scenes of Winter was the first film you produced, and that was what, 79?
I was still working at Radio City Music Hall when we optioned the book. Well, we went to Massachusetts and to Harvard, where Ann Beattie was teaching. Somehow, three of us actors, Mark Metcalf, Amy Robinson, and I, convinced her to give us the rights. And when we sold the script to 20th Century Fox, the studio sent a car for me to go to the airport, a limousine to fly first class, and it picked me up at Radio City Music Hall. I said, I got to take the weekend. I got to take the week off. And it was from that movie, I still hadn't gotten an acting job. I was so frustrated. It was each audition was more painful than the next, and the rejection and all the things you've heard about any early years of an actor. And but I was able in Chilly Scenes to give myself a small part. They got a huge laugh. And from that 5 minutes on film, suddenly I started to get acting jobs. So one really helped the other in a very unintended way.
But then how do we get to After Hours? Because, we've got Tim Burton as an also-ran. You've got Martin Scorsese directing a film that you weren't necessarily expecting to have access to Martin Scorsese for this film. Also, there's no De Niro in After Hours. There's, no Harvey Keitel.
I was waiting for that hammer to drop, but it never did.
Well, it's still a pretty great movie. I did just rewatch it after a little bit of a gap. I was one of those teenagers watching it on VHS in places not in Manhattan and thinking, huh. And, now knowing the city the way I do, it's really kind of funny to see where you guys were shooting and how you were shooting and all of that.
Very different place. Yeah.
And it's now out on Criterion. If anyone really wants to, you can totally get a hold of it. There's new background material, all of that.
And so is Chilly Scenes.
Exactly. Same with Chilly Scenes. So I do want to talk about, though, that balance that you have to hit with those three different disciplines, though, because acting, directing, producing, it all comes back to story and how much you believe in the story and how much you can sell the story, right? That's how you get the thing done. But it's a different set of muscles for each of those jobs.
Yeah, very much so. I've always thought of it, it's a right brain, left brain, a theory that's been sort of disproved apparently. But for the sake of argument, the left brain is the creative and the right is the pragmatic. And it is involving, a different side. I could use the left brain as a producer when developing a script with the writer, but when it comes to budget and the logistics of location and all the things of scouting and location scouting and all the millions of things that go into it, making a movie, it's a different side of your brain. But it was also incredibly fulfilling because I like what you don't quite get in acting, but you do as a director and a producer, is total engrossment in every aspect of the movie. You don't have to think about the life you left behind, whatever relationship has gone south, whatever thing is going on in your personal life. All you have to worry about is all the different aspects of this movie that really consume your life for, the year or so it takes up. I found that one really helped the other, and I've been bouncing back and forth to that. You mentioned a balance, though I never quite figured out the balance. Whenever I got exposure in a movie as an actor, the logical thing would be to cash in on that and go on to the next bigger picture, just a bigger audience. And I would find I would get a little, it usually timed out when I had a picture that I'd been developing, Amy Robinson and I had been developing, that was ready to go into production. I had a loyalty to this movie and to my partner that I would follow through. And of course, in that time, you become that thing of get me Griffin Dunne to which one is Griffin Dunne? You know, all that heat dissipates, and you kind of have to start all over again.
But isn't it also you chasing the story? I mean, that's what it sounds like.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing that always got me was, you know, everything that we produced, and that I would then direct later on. It was always the story. It was, you know, Chilly Scenes of Winter. We understood obsession and heartache, and also mixed with humor, you know, and that element of humor and melancholy, or you know, hot sauce, sweet sauce, sour sauce, those emotions and incidents that are hilarious one minute and then deeply sad in another. I've never strayed from that kind of theme in a movie of what draws me to it.
And having read your memoir, I'm wondering if that isn't partially listening to you describe, you know, the projects that you're excited about and producing, if that doesn't come back to a lot of your own life. I mean, there are highs, there are lows, I mean, yeah, Dostoevsky, all happy families are alike. I'm not saying your family was unhappy, but there's a lot. And obviously, we're not going to spoil it because, I mean, there's a lot of joy in this book and there's a lot of fun. And some of it is public record too. But at the same time, there's a lot. Your mom is diagnosed with MS. Your dad's life is very complicated between the alcoholism and the addiction and his homosexuality, which he had to hide for a really long time. All of these things. And you're the kid with a little brother and a little sister. And this whole world. I mean, you can't make this up.
Yeah.
I mean, this would be a really, again, I know I said it at the top of the show, and your editor has written novels, and I'm sure he would have said to you, my friend, you cannot have this. This cannot stand. This does not work. No one is going to buy into it. And yet, really, it was Tuesday, or in this case, Friday afternoon. And I'm hoping you'll tell us where the title of the book comes from.
Well, I'm glad you said that about the joy and mixed with truly sad and devastating episodes that have happened to, you know, my mother and my father's, you know, rising from the ashes. But those ashes were horrific to witness as a kid. The Friday Afternoon Club is in reference to a gathering at my mother's house that my sister, she had just started entering acting class. And she would, on Friday afternoons, presumably after class, all the kids would go to my mom's house. And there were all these young actors just at the beginning of their careers, and George Clooney and Miguel Ferrer and Tim Hutton. They were all just starting out. Actually, Tim had already won an Academy Award by this time, but it was, you know, the beginning of everything. And I wanted a title that would be somewhat mysterious, but also sound like fun. And these gatherings were a lot of fun. And you know, when, unlike my career as an actor, when Dominique decided to be an actress, I was the first person she called, expecting me to be thrilled for her. And I was going, "Oh, Dominique, please. It's the worst. It's the worst profession. Oh, you're going to hate it. I mean, especially as a woman, as an attractive girl. Like, I just, and she was really pissed that I wasn't more supportive. I don't think more than 2 weeks went by where she wasn't cast in a TV movie called Diary of a Teenage Hitchhiker. And guess who she played? The teenage hitchhiker. So right out of the gate, she started working. And it was always my hope that, you know, as my career rose, and she was, you know, we were both, you know, in a really great place when it all went terribly wrong. So it was always my hope that we'd, you know, be a brother-sister duo, like so many of the brothers teams we see today.
What's the age difference between you and Tom?
4 years.
4 years, okay. And so you were not terribly old then when she was murdered. She was 22?
Yeah, she was 22. Yeah, I guess I was 26. I was thinking myself as 24, but you're right, I was 26.
But still, that's not very, I mean, that's not very old. And the whole world has turned on its edge. Your mother is not doing particularly well physically because of the MS.
Hmm.
Your dad has a new career. And I went back and I read the original article that sort of kicked everything off. And I was really young when that all sort of happened. And so my perception of it as an adolescent would be very different from my perception now. You write about it in the book, and obviously we're going to leave most of that to the book, but just sort of how does it feel now to have sat again with that story? I mean, both of your parents are now passed. You have a brother who's still alive. How did you get through the writing of
It
that
was the most
experience?
difficult part. It was
Yeah.
absolutely the most difficult part, because, when I was, as I said, I started chronologically and I tried to sort of write once I was born, I tried to write in the voice of a young
Hmm.
boy and then find some maturity and texture as I got older. And as you say, I was a fully grown person by that time. And, the people in my family would come alive when I was writing up to that point. They were still alive, but now they were alive in the worst period of our lives. And to go through, I wanted to be very factual about all the different things that legally took place. Well, really from her being on life support for so long, and then the funeral, and then just go through it. It was very difficult to write about, and in my life at that time during the trial was this absolutely absurd thing going on where I was in a comedy, and a really broad comedy called Johnny Dangerously. And on the days that I didn't go to sit in the courtroom with my family, I would be on set at 20th Century Fox, playing, of all things, a district attorney, but in a very, very broad comedy, with Michael Keaton, who became a very, very close friend as a result. Um, so I remember, when I was, getting to that point where I'm on set the day the verdict comes out. We weren't expecting it. You were waiting. You get a call at the last minute. Okay, then it's time for the press to get there and all that stuff. So I'm on set, and after the verdict, which was a horrifically short time for the killer, Mark Metcalf comes to my trailer and tells me, um, and I wanted to go home, and so the only time I got actually cried typing um, was when I told Michael when I got to the set, we were ready to shoot the scene. I told him, and he said, Griffin's got to go home. So I don't know what the hell see that still gets to me. Um, just that understanding and kindness. Um, I don't know what I would have done if I had to stay on that set that day. But I was able to rush home and and be with them. But it was also a day that my father did one of the most courageous things in that courtroom. Um, that harkened back to his original character as a war hero, um, and really let that judge and the everyone participating have it, and it set off the outrage over the verdict and over the handling of the case, and it led to my father becoming an activist for victims' rights. Everything he wrote for Vanity Fair was it was a crime piece, which most were. It wasn't just about the killer. It was making people know that Phil Spector killed Lana Clarkson and would say her name, and that not describe her as a third-rate actress the way the rest of the press did, or um, with the Simpson family and the Brown family, he was always sensitive in everything he wrote. And then my mother became an activist and started her own victims' rights group that grew out of parents of murdered children, which were incredibly supportive to us during that trial. So it changed all our lives, but rather than my mother um, getting worse from the MS, which is what we all expected, she found strength. She wasn't going to let this happen, and she had to make sense of it. And her Justice for Victims of Homicide, passed laws that are um, now in 22 other states, that still go on. One particularly called Marsy's Law.
It was a big moment for America too, because I think, before these celebrity trials where your family was at the forefront of that, unfortunately. And it really, at the risk of making a bad analogy, but like the Manson trial was the Manson, it just, now we just have this sort of relentless marching through. And it's
Yes.
partially the media. It's partially, I mean, your dad led the charge to a certain extent, but it has kind of gone way beyond, I think, what even he would have envisioned.
Yeah, I mean the fascination with crime and crime
Mhm.
podcasts and all of that. But it did, when the Manson thing happened, uh people were more fascinated or uh obsessed with Manson and his members than they were with, Sharon and the rest of the victims. They were, so I'd like to think, that my father helped, alter that perception when people see uh, see crimes that are glorified. They think about something other than their fascination with a serial killer or you know various crimes that take place.
I have to say, like, watching your dad's career switch gears, I'm not sure I ever knew that he'd been in television when I was younger, because why would I know? Suddenly there was that moment where Vanity Fair was just everywhere, and, buses and airplanes and all of it kind of thing. And he had a complicated relationship with his brother, John Gregory Dunne, who was also a journalist and a screenwriter. And they'd actually, Panic in Needle Park, I didn't realize your dad had produced it. And
Hmm.
John and Joan had written it. And that was Al Pacino's first role. And
Hmm.
everyone was kind of like, well, yeah, it's just Romeo and Juliet with junkies. It's like,
Hmm.
okay, well,
That was a pitch.
that's a quick pitch, and it totally worked and whatnot. But you were a little bit of a bridge between your uncle and your dad for a while. It seems like they had a really complicated relationship by all
They did.
reports.
They did, and it was not during Panic in Needle Park. The three of them
Mm,
were as close a trio as you could
right.
possibly imagine. They were, Jules and Jim and Joan. But as my father's, he said, he was struggling with alcohol and drugs, and that didn't serve him well when it came time to doing plays, and there were a lot of problems with that movie, and then there were a lot of problems with my dad's finances. And one of the things that pretty much can break up any relationship, let alone between brothers, is when one borrows money from the other, and that
Yeah.
just it brings on shame from the person who asked for the money, and then they resent the person for giving it to them, and John is whatever his point of view is, it just makes things. And then they're brothers. They grew up
Right.
together. There was a big age difference. They had very different relationship with their father. My grandfather, his father, would beat my father when he was a little boy with a belt and call him a sissy. And John had only loving memories of their father, the Dr. Dunn. But it really wasn't until Dad's career, money problems, alcohol really took a nosedive, really brought him down. Um, and John and Jones, it timed with John and Jones' ascent into Hollywood as during this uh, great period in cinema history with all these great filmmakers in the 70s, and the people that my father entertained, they were already in their twilight years, the great actors and directors
Right.
I described. And a new movement was taking place, and John and Joan were, screenwriters and magazine writers, and right at the head of it. Slouching Towards Bethlehem just was a huge success, as was Play It As It Lays, and John's books did very well, and they were right in the center, just like my father and mother were in the zeitgeist of Hollywood, only in a different decade.
Yeah, I forget where I read this, but Joan actually wanted Sam Peckinpah
Oh
to
yeah,
direct Play It As It Lays. And I was like, okay. I mean, that shows you I don't have as deep a film knowledge as I should, but I know Sam Peckinpah's work. And I was like, that's kind of fast. I mean, I get it and it works, but at the same time, it's like the first time I read that, I was like,
I know. I mean,
okay.
what I would have done to have seen that movie.
Right?
Um, and I've never, I'm not quite sure how far along it actually wasn't Joan's idea. Apparently, Sam had read it and approached them, and Joan, something clicked, and Joan going, "Well, that's a movie I would like to see."
There's also something about the desert where if you're
Yeah,
shooting in the desert or you've set something in the desert, and Play It As It Lays is a novel I quite love. And if you're working in the desert in any way, shape, or form, you have to have someone who really understands what the place is like. And because it's so weird. And, the fact that you can wake up in 30-degree weather and suddenly it's 110 by lunchtime and then it dropped, the desert's just a
no,
really
that's
weird,
Peckinpah
weird
country for
place.
sure.
Yeah,
And
exactly. And you're just like, okay.
just imagine how many dead rattlesnakes would be in that movie.
Uh,
Uh,
you know,
it would, but he would definitely, and Joan's, a woman of the West.
yeah, completely.
She's born and bred, and her parents, crossed the frontier, and so that kind of Western ethic, I think, would be a bonding theme for
Hmm.
Peckinpah and Joan. I think probably that's why she responded to that idea.
Yeah. John and Joan wrote, what, 6 films together? I mean, Studio, too. If you haven't read John Gregory Dunne's Studio, it holds up. He
I
wrote
mean,
it
it's
in
one of the best
68
books
and it
ever written
holds
about
up.
Hollywood. Yeah, and it's the only book that ever, um, where a studio had ever let a
Yeah, let
writer
someone have access. I'm
live
still
up,
amazed.
sit in story meetings and chronicle for a year, have complete access to everyone, and chronicle the worst year in the studio's history, which was also the turning point that led to the great movies it led to Dennis Hopper's movies and
Easy Rider. Yeah, Easy
Easy
Rider. All
Rider.
of those movies that we think of in the 70s, like French Connection, all of that stuff comes out of essentially this floppy year. And it was 67 into 68, right? So it's
Yeah,
that same huge
absolutely, where they
moment.
had all their money on Dr. Dolittle and movies that just
Right.
were given green light by, middle-aged or older men
Hmm.
um, who had no idea what their audience is.
Oh yeah, we got Chinatown out of it too. Like
Oh
it's
yeah. Oh, it's
wild the
got
movie, all of
all
those
of
70s
Ashley's
movies
movies.
that right, Harold and Maude, all it
Harold
like
and
it's just
Maude,
it's kind
and
of
Boom.
trippy when I think about it. But you end up producing and directing the documentary about your Aunt Joan. And
Mhm.
so Uncle John predeceases your dad 2003 and then 2008.
I'm terrible with the dates, but I believe you're right about 2003. But and
Okay.
then Quintana,
But basically, yeah, and then
yeah.
your cousin. So it's by the time you're filming, are you filming in 17 or are you filming before 17 with Joan for the documentary Center Cannot Hold?
Oh yeah, I'm filming. I've started at least a year, maybe
Okay.
a year and
Okay.
a half before. I self-financed the interviews with
Hmm.
Joan, hoping I would get a deal,
Right.
and I didn't. And all the um, all the places that we went to had turned us down, and then my cousin Annabelle Dunn
Right.
um, and we made a sizzle reel, and once the sizzle reel and people saw, wow, Hollywood
Yeah,
stingrays,
yeah, yeah.
the
Right.
'70s, and they saw the glamour that I did from that time, and Joan's incredible life story and where she came from,
Hmm.
all those places that turned us down just came roaring back from that sizzle reel, which went viral all over the world.
I remember hearing that you were doing a Kickstarter for it, and I was like, really? We need to kickstart
Yeah,
Joan Didion. But okay.
and I
I
never would have
mean,
gotten enough money to have made it.
financing is wild, but you exceeded your financing goal pretty quickly, if I remember correctly, right?
Within the next day,
Yeah.
well
Okay.
past it.
I mean, that's the thing everyone wanted to know. I mean, there is a generation of writers who've come up and let's say, very attached to your Aunt Joan's style and voice, and not necessarily the same thing that I see a lot of critics now going back and saying, well, everyone's just trying to hash out their insecurities on the page just like she did. And I'm like, well, that's not actually what she was doing, but okay. It's wild to see, and also sort of the language that goes along with it. And it happens less with your dad's work and less with your Uncle John's work and much more with Joan's work. And I think it's probably because she's a woman, but there's a language of ownership that kind of goes along with people's interpretations of what she's doing on the page. And I'm like, can we just enjoy these cut glass sentences? Because for me, it was always about the style. And I discovered her as a teenager. And I mean, I think I rolled my eyes a tiny bit when I realized that she had this direct line to Hemingway. And then she came out and said, no, I have this direct line to Hemingway. And I'm like, really? Oh, okay. I can't
That's
get
how
away
she
from that dude.
typed the sentences.
No, I get it.
Learn rhythm and telling a story. And you were a teenager when you discovered Joan. And what I'm most proud of was all the teenagers that discovered Joan after the movie came out.
Yeah. Oh, it's wild to see. It is wild to see.
I wish I took this picture, but when I was taking a subway up to St. John the Divine, John's Memorial, on the train with us were a group of girls, maybe 16 to 19, in black dresses, all holding her books, going to the same memorial.
Yeah. I love that.
I went,
that is such a New York moment. That is totally, totally a New York moment. And they have so much good stuff to read. But your Aunt Joan's, it was the White Album, or was it Slouching Towards Bethlehem, which was the first book that you were able to read sort of front to back in one sitting? And I say that because of your dyslexia. I mean, that is not an easy thing to sit and do. But which one was it? It was one of the first.
No, it was the White Album.
It was the White Album. Okay.
Slouching, just I was too young, or it
right. Okay.
Me, and I had enough. John's writing, however, that kind of sharp Irish tough humor.
Yeah.
That I read very easily.
Okay.
But the White Album, and I mean particularly the White Album, the book of the White Album. That was a revelation. That was where I realized, what a powerful writer I was related to. And was really in awe of that writing. It was like my portal into, once I got that voice, once I understood her style, and everything I read came easily afterwards.
I just like the idea of teenage you being able to sit with a family member's work in a different way, because I mean, obviously I had never met any of these people, and I was just kind of like, what is happening here? Can I have
also
more
had my
of this,
own little
please?
Manson story too, which I have in the book.
Yeah, and why don't we leave that for people? Because I mean, here's the thing that I love about Friday Afternoon Club is just that these stories pop, and again, you're just like, well, and we were doing this and da-da-da-da-da, and you were just a kid moving through the world and figuring out, but it was an era where, we weren't wrapped in bubble wrap, right? Like, and maybe we were raised a little bit by wolves, and well-intentioned wolves, but I mean, you could hitchhike. I was taking the T, into Boston at 11, and then the adults would come pick you up when you were done. We don't live that way anymore, and I think that's part of it, right?
I can say that as a parent. I'm just as guilty of snowplowing and solving, and who couldn't be fascinated by everything that their child does. But there wasn't that when I was growing up, and it sounds like you. I call it benign neglect. We knew we were loved,
right?
But they didn't pay that much attention, and I'm so grateful they didn't. I'm so grateful I didn't get murdered hitchhiking at 13 in LA. But I'm also grateful I was left alone to, make mistakes and have adventures, and and sneak out at night and have no one notice I was missing until breakfast. I treasure those experiences, and I never felt, how come nobody's paying attention to me? I mean, every parent was like that. I think I'm, in that generation. My daughter's now in her early 30s. But I think when I became a father, I think, if not shortly before, around that time, that was the time that being a parent was the most fascinating thing in your life. And all you talked about with your friends were your child and what little accomplishment they did and all that kind of stuff that would bore me silly right now to talk to somebody else about. But I was one of those parents, and I'm also glad I had my upbringing as well.
And that's the thing. I mean, I was one of those kids that would get trotted out at the end of the dinner. And my parents threw amazing parties. I mean, they threw the parties. And my brother and I would sit at the top of the staircase and try and listen into everything because the
Yeah.
adults were so fascinating.
I
And then,
know.
of course, it
Wow.
was time for us to be trotted down to say goodnight to everyone and then trotted back upstairs. But when I think about it, I'm just like, how did those people live as long as they did between the booze and the cigarettes and everything else? You're just like,
Well,
wow.
I think they didn't live that long. I think the 60s was the median age. They all had a stroke or croaked or
Oh, yeah,
something.
but when you're little, you think that's,
That's
forever.
ancient. Absolutely.
Now we know, but at the
Mhm.
time it was like, wow, this is
Years
completely
later, I
moved
was
on.
working on a movie with Dennis Hoffman, and we were like smoking a joint,
Yeah, yeah.
not on set, but and he said, I remember your parents bringing you downstairs in your little matching bathrobes, bowing and curtsying to say goodnight. I thought that was the saddest thing I ever saw in my whole life. And I, and yeah, um, it really killed my high, I'll tell you that.
Well, it also sounds like a really weird thing for Dennis Hopper to say, but then again, not that I ever met the
Not
man, but I'm just like,
surprising.
really? Okay. Well, that's part of the fun of the Friday afternoon club because all of these bits, and again, Sean Connery does save you from drowning at a very young
And he does.
age. You're just filling in gaps in these cultural moments, right? And you happen to be there and you happen to be paying attention. And I think that's part of the fun. Not every kid is paying attention to what's going on around them, especially when the adults are, the adults. But when you do, you kind of get a cool thing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Paying attention. I'm so glad I did. I wasn't conscious of it, but I just have my memories are so vivid
Hmm.
from particularly my earlier years. I'm speaking tomorrow. I'm eulogizing one of the last um, people to die who were friends of my parents, and I've been thinking about that time where you're a child and you look at your parents' friends and they're just old and usually drunk and smoking and they're just sort of silly people. And then once you cross that moment where they become your friends, where you're an adult, you can actually take them in and their fascinating lives. And there was a man that was courting my mother that my brother and I used to make terrible fun of, and because he spoke in a posh accent and the ashes would get on his. Well, it wasn't until very late in his life, his name was Ivan Moffat, that I found out that when you look at the films of the liberation of Auschwitz with George Stevens by his side, that he was there. He took that. He then wrote A Place in the Sun. He wrote Shane. When got older, I realized that I went, what are, shame on you, first impressions. My parents had fascinating friends growing up, and I was able to become very close with a guy named Earl McGrath, who's in the book. He became like so close throughout his life, and
Hmm.
he and his wife Camila, and
McGrath used to throw parties with your aunt when they lived on
absolutely,
Franklin Avenue. Okay.
Joan dedicated two books to him.
Right. Okay. So that's the Earl McGrath. I was like, that name sounds familiar, but
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. So I was able to, see the through line from a child to a grown up, and acknowledge these people, for what they've done, and gratefully have them be friends of my own.
It's a really satisfying read. It's a really, really, really satisfying read. But now I'm wondering what's next. I mean, you've got all of these different things that you work on. You've got your fingers in all sorts of different projects, but what's the next thing?
My acting, as I get older, I find
Yeah.
myself getting more jobs than I did as a younger person. Um, but I was just in some episodes of Only Murders in the Building,
Excellent.
which was ridiculous fun, and I have a movie coming out in September called Ex-Husbands that I'm the star of, the central
Okay.
character, back to number one on the call sheet. Um, but I've been continuing to write since the book. It's not like, oh, I wrote a book, huh, I don't
Hmm.
have to do that anymore. Um, I've been I wrote an introduction for a collection of Joan's books for vintage,
Yep.
which was daunting. I look at the other introductions of Hilton Hawes and different people, and they were like, "Oh Jesus, I don't belong here." But I did, and I combined the personal with the literary, and uh, I wrote a Father's Day piece for a Wall Street Journal, and so I want to continue writing, and I kind of do see in a cheap sort of way, but I do see that there's a very entertaining sort of Zelig like Licorice Pizza sort of movie
Mm-hmm.
or series in here of the central character who is in the center of all of these moments and has the wherewithal to realize it, and run with it, and has these very close relationships with fascinating grown-ups and flawed grown-ups, and from a dysfunctional family, as if there are some functional families out there. And so I'm just going to keep being as busy as I always have been.
Good. So the producer hat is always on, is what
Oh
you're
yeah.
saying. That's the one that just genuinely never comes off.
In fact, we're actually developing a series of the White Album it'll be streaming, and Michelle Williams, who I've always reminded me of Joan,
Mm-hmm.
will be our Joan.
Excellent. That sounds really, really great. Griffin Dunne, thank you so much. Friday Afternoon Club, a family memoir, is out now.
Thank you, Miwa, very much.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of fantastic books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Friday Afternoon Club. I'm Mark. I'm at my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, and I'm joined by my Detroit area book buddy, Donald. How are you, Donald?
Oh, I'm really excited to talk about this one.
Nice.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, same. I love Griffin Dunne. So I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. I couldn't not talk about Joan Didion when really even thinking about Griffin Dunne, who I also love, and really can't wait for folks to dive into this memoir. It is wild, fascinating, and just full of characters that you want to spend so much time with. But Joan Didion is always very close to my reader heart. So I'm going to go ahead and recommend South and West. It's a fascinating revisit of some compiled journals from a 1970s road trip, as well as a journalistic assignment that maybe didn't quite pan out how they expected. So the book is divided into two parts. Notes on the South covers and highlights a trip through Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi. In this, she observes in her brilliant signature trademark way the Southern small town life. The way, though, that her commentary on the 70s and how it links and mirrors and reflects the current day South is absolutely poignant and fascinating. I feel like Joan Didion has this kind of future-seeing soothsayer kind of ability in her journalistic prowess, that all of us could maybe dive back into her backlist and see how things look now and see how eerie you feel. Part two, which is called California Notes, is a compilation of some notebooks that she originally was using when writing for a Patty Hearst story for Rolling Stone. The project was scrapped, but the compilation of these notes not only talks quite a bit about Patty Hearst and the craziness surrounding her trial, but it really talks more about the West Coast and the way that things were going in that time. It's just wonderful. And having the two of those together really paints a very interesting picture of the U.S. in the 70s. So if you're looking to expand the Dunne family saga, or if you are just hungry for brilliant writing, check out South and West by Joan Didion. Donald, what do you have for us?
Oh, I'm so excited. I have with me today Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. And so for those who are unaware, he made a film in the 90s, an adaptation of this book. What's really fascinating about this is that this was not an easy movie for him to make. It caused some heartache down the line with Hollywood. He also needed to potentially hire an exorcist at one point. due to a witch who they had hired to give support and knowledge about witchcraft. She cursed him, according to him. So, he had a lot of drama on set when it came to that. But the book itself is just an absolute treat. So Alice Hoffman, she is the mother of magical realism. As we look at all the great books that are out there now, she really started that with, books about witches, but also about nature, about science, fairy tales, all of that kind of coming together. This particular book is about two wonderful sisters and their aunts. There's a murder in there. It's suspenseful. And it's actually the first in a series that she concluded just a few years ago. So there's 4 wonderful books all together. And again, that is Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. If you haven't read this, please grab a copy and watch the movie too. You're going to love that.
I love the way that you had a through line for Griffin Dunne and his kind of ancillary career aspirations with Practical Magic, because I think it's a really nice way to have a bit of a dessert after you dive into this like wild family story full of fascinating people. You get to kind of continue to explore, even if it's a work of fiction that he didn't create. He had such a big part in it. So nice pick. That is all we have for today, though. Thanks so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. You can follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Donald, where can we find you?
You can follow my home store at BN Fairlane Green.
That's all, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.